you can see. Hold on 1 second. Can you guys see that? No, this thing is not having it. There we go. Can you see a desktop now? Awesome.
Yes.
Can you see that?
Color background.
How about these? Can you see?
Yeah, we can see that. We can see
Awesome.
that.
Cool.
Yep.
Nice. Yesterday I could see myself, but apparently not anymore. Cool. So what we're going to do today, guys, is we're just going to talk about how to design your own training programs around, particularly around the class structure that's already built in. Rather than me kind of going through how to design an entire program for yourself. I was just saying to Cheryl that that's quite challenging, and really there's not much of a necessity to do that if you're getting class programming anyway, but often there's a lot of stuff you guys want to work on and improve on in particular, which there just isn't enough volume of when you're doing the classwork, or you're just following like 3 times a week Mob Strong and maybe 2 times a week Mob Engine or something like that, and you're missing something that you particularly want to work on. So we're going to kind of cover that. What we're going to go through in particular is just quickly why a structure is needed when it comes to training, and why it's important. What kind of the basics of periodization, planning, and then programming is. So I kind of discussed 3 different things, periodization being the really long term, planning being the medium term, and programming being the really, really short term, and kind of what the basics of those are, just so you guys have a bit of an understanding of what I'm talking about. Then we're going to go through a bit of a simplified strategy of which you guys can use to do your planning and your programming. Then we're going to do a case study of just an individual athlete with something particular to work on, to give an idea of how that would work, and give an example of what you guys could do, and you can kind of relate that to anything you in particular you want to work on. Then we'll talk about kind of how you can regulate that yourself and your program, and how you can be flexible in your program, and how important flexibility is. Otherwise, you don't really have to stick to the program exactly the entire time. Kind of need to go with the flow a little bit and see how you feel. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about how to kind of develop specific qualities, fitness qualities, being strength, power, muscle gain, endurance, etc. And then I'll give you guys a chance to ask some questions at the end. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. At the moment, guys, I can't see any of you, so I just want to check you're still there.
Yep.
Yeah. Normally, when I tried this earlier, there was you guys are up in the top right-hand corner. But
I think you can click it down too. So if there's a little bar, you can click to have like at least 5 of us on the screen. Click the top right, and there's a little. Should be 4 options.
There is note.
Oh.
I don't know. It was there earlier. Oh well. As long as if I disappear, I'm going. Jake, send me a text message. Awesome. So we're just going to go through the definitions of a couple of the common terms I'm going to use in this presentation. Forgive me if some of you know these already, but it's just useful to be kind of up to date on these so you know what I'm talking about. When I use the term volume, it refers to the amount of reps and sets of either a given movement or in total in the session or the program. It's important just to kind of be aware of the volume and that you're doing, be it in the session or in the week, because that's one of the things we can manipulate to progress. If that volume's kind of stagnant and similar the whole time, there's not really much adaptation for happening. There's not going to be any reason for your body to adapt. The intensity, that refers to how difficult it is, the relative difficulty. Usually you see it prescribed as either percentage, say like 5 times 5 at 70% of your 1 rep max back squat. That would be your intensity. Or recently we've been using a bit more of RPE, which is kind of like...
No, it's you.
Yeah?
No, my mom. That was my mom.
Denise is in.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to let you know as well. I can't see anyone, so I don't know who's in, who's not at the moment. But we're just going through the definitions, and then we're going to go through a bit more on kind of how to design your own programming, etc. So you haven't missed anything really yet. Then we got the density. So the density is being like how often a specific stimulus is applied. Be it kind of like if you do strength 3 times a week, then the density would be 3 times weekly. You can even be like within a training block, say a month. If you do a specific training once a week, then it'd be 4 times in a month. And then periodization is not something which is commonly used outside the world of training. It's basically refers to the logical sequencing of different training blocks to develop a very specific type of fitness. So usually it'd be in a sporting context. Say you want to develop someone's speed, then you'd want to develop all of the physical capacities that underpin speed earlier on to then be able to peak in your speed at a particular time, say a competition. Gets a little bit more complex with CrossFit because you kind of have to be good at everything at one time rather than good at one particular thing. But we go into a little bit more detail of that a bit later. So first thing we're going to cover is kind of why having a structure to your training is really, really important. First thing is that your body basically wants to stay the same. It doesn't like change. Your whole physiology is designed around maintaining homeostasis, so basically staying the same. Change physically is pretty demanding on the body, uses a lot of resources, so it doesn't really want to do it. So you've got to be quite consistent and basically very convincing to get your body to actually change. Once you've already gone past your, what's often referred to as beginner gains, when you first start something new, like a new training style, we probably all experienced this when we first started CrossFit. For the first 4 to 6, maybe even 9 months, you get pretty good results really, really quick. And then you start getting that kind of stagnant, that plateau, and you don't really see much of a consistent improvement after that. I mean, that's very, very normal because when you first start, anything that's new, anything that's novel will cause an adaptation. You find this massively when you work with children. It's kind of, you can throw anything at them and they get better from it. But that's only has a kind of a certain shelf life. And once that's been kind of used up, you really need a bit more consistency and progressive nature to be able to drive an adaptation. You need to really consistently convince your body that it needs to change. That's why it's really important to build that structure in the first place. If you're just kind of guessing and throwing shit at the wall and hoping some of it will stick, you're going to kind of be leaving a lot on the table adaptation-wise. So when it comes to building a structure, you kind of need to follow a bit of a structure to build that in the first place. So what we usually need to do is you need to assess where you're currently at. I mean, that doesn't need to be a really in-depth assessment, even if it's just reflecting on what you want to improve, what you feel hasn't improved massively recently. And then from that, you can kind of set your goals. Having goals is pretty important. Gives you somewhere, a direction to go in. And from those goals, you can then design the whole rest of your training program. The way it's set out here, where it says assess your current level, then you set your goals. And then once you've set the goals, you can see the difference between what your goal is and what your current level is. And then from there, you can see pretty clearly what physical adaptations you need to get, basically to move you from your current level to your goals. Once you've seen what physical adaptations you need, you can work out what training interventions, what training style you would need to get those physical adaptations to happen. If you want to get stronger because your current level of strength isn't strong enough, isn't high enough, then your required adaptation would be increasing strength. Therefore, your strength training, such as squats, deadlifts, presses, that sort of thing, would be your necessary training intervention. Set those out. Then once you've set those out, you can implement that training, do that training program for a while, and then you go straight back into the assessment. So it's a continuous circle the entire time. At no point do you kind of complete training. That's one of the nice things about it, is you can always get better at something. So you're constantly going through this cycle the entire time. We're going to go into a little bit deeper on the assessment side of things. The assessment we do quite often at the gym anyway, even if it's something you don't really notice it happening. The test retest kind of underpins any training program that you might follow. if you don't test at the start and then retest at the end, you don't really have any objective measure to see whether you've improved or not. Just the feeling of, I think I've improved. I mean, that can be really, really useful, but often you can be quite misguided. You can just have a thought that you're not very strong one day when you're really tired, that's not going very well. And then a couple of weeks later, when you're feeling a lot better, you've had a really good night's sleep and you lift something heavy, you're like, oh, sweet, my training program's working really well. But realistically, you're just a little bit less fatigued. So it's quite important to have those assessments in there. When it comes to assessing, you need to make sure that your assessment is appropriate for what you're trying to test. So say, again, I'll use the strength example. If you're trying to measure your strength, then a 1RM or a 3RM on a given movement would be the most appropriate, rather than say something, as it says on the screen, something like Grace, the CrossFit workout, which is like 30 clean and jerks. While strength is important in that, it's not actually a strength test. So if you were to do that test and then work on your strength, you might not improve on your test retest. Your Grace time might not get better, but you could have improved your strength. It doesn't have to be something super fancy. It can just be anything, as long as you've got that objective measure down, something you can test and then retest at the end. The important thing to remember for your retest is try to make the situation you do it in as close to when you do the first test as possible. Doesn't have to be exactly on a set date. For example, if you do your first test and then 6 weeks down the line, your last week, you've had a terrible week at work, you haven't slept at all, then doing your retest is not going to be really a very valid measure of your improvement. So just bearing that sort of thing in mind when you do that assessment. Once you've got the assessment, the goal setting, I mean, we've all heard about SMART goals. They're kind of popular for a good reason. They do really help you set out good quality goals. The first one being specific. It's in the world of CrossFit and functional fitness, what we guys train. It's quite difficult to be super specific with your goals because it's a sport or a training modality where you kind of train everything all the time. But each section within CrossFit, you can set goals within those pretty easily. Measurable, we were talking about that in the test retest. You need to be able to have something where you can show improvement. The biggest one that I see a lot of people make a mistake on is the attainability of their goal. Often they set really, really high goals without quite understanding the investments and the sacrifices that it takes to get to a certain level. Often you see people, be it other people at the gym or athletes, social media, etc., who have attained certain results, but you don't see kind of what they've given up and what investments and sacrifices they've made into that. So having an understanding of what's attainable for you and what's realistic for you is quite important. That's something where you can just do a little bit of reflection, and you can come and chat to a coach about that sort of thing, and we can help you out with that. I mean, we don't want to limit people. Having high goals is always useful, but they've got to be at least realistic in some regard. Ideally, they want to be relevant to your bigger picture of like why you train in the first place. Often I find people get into CrossFit. Most people get into training CrossFit, they start because they want to be a little fitter, they want to lose a little bit of weight, they want to be happy and healthy. And then they get into the world of CrossFit and suddenly their biggest aim is to get kip and pull-ups or PR a time in a CrossFit workout. I mean, while that's nice to have a little bit of a shift towards performance goals, might not actually help you move towards what your actual long-term bigger picture was. So making sure they're relevant to that, and it's something which helps you move towards your long-term goal and your bigger picture. Time-based, that one in the world of training is pretty important because the whole structure of your training can be based around that. And you've got to pick a time frame which is actually suitable for whatever goal you're trying to achieve. Be it learning a skill can often be a lot faster than getting a physical adaptation, or endurance builds a lot faster than strength. So you can set an appropriate time frame based off whatever your goal is. Once you've done your goal setting, you go into your long-term planning. So your long-term planning, this in the world of sport and kind of strength and conditioning is referred to as a macro cycle. It's kind of the big picture. Basically, you want to set out a time frame, be it 6 months, a year, or even shorter, 3 months, of where you start to where you want to be. And you want to break that down. You want to work backwards from that kind of goal to where you currently are and lay out a long-term plan. I mean, this doesn't have to be really, really detailed. If I was working with an athlete who in a year's time had a really important competition, you get pretty detailed with this. But if you're just doing it yourself to help your own programming and help your own training, then it doesn't have to be super detailed. But there does need to be a long-term thought process behind it. If you don't layer these out and you don't see the long-term picture, often what you do week to week can end up getting in the way of each other, and there end up not being a progression to that. So basically you can see here how each block would relate to each other. Say you've got 6 months. Each month you might do a very slightly different training style. You want to make sure that each one of those blocks builds upon the last one rather than getting in the way of. So again, if you need help on this sort of thing, then approach a coach about it or ask me the questions on. But usually when it comes to a physical capacity, they all have underpinning qualities which support them. For example, strength. If you don't have stability and mobility around that joint, it's difficult to get strong. So you've got to make sure that you have those prerequisites first, building them in earlier to be able to improve that strength later on. Also, these are really useful to refer back to. If you don't have at least some kind of record of what you've done or what the plan was, you can't tell what worked and what didn't. The reason you wouldn't go super detailed into these is, one, because the main thing is whenever you make a plan, you very rarely stick to it 100%. I mean, I used to work with a few schools, and I used to write programs, long-term programs for some of the kids, and then things would come along which you didn't expect, injuries, etc. Or I didn't quite, being the age I was, realize how much exam time would affect kids and how that would change their ability to deal with training, etc. So my training program would have to change massively. So I wouldn't want to write week in, week out exactly what they're doing 6 months in advance, because it would never happen anyway. Just needs to be a kind of a goal and a guideline for each individual section. Then you kind of zoom in on a small block. Say the macro cycle was 6 months long. Each month would be referred to as a mesocycle. So that would be just a training block. Think, for example, in Mob Strong, you kind of have your 4 to 5 week training blocks. That would be referred to as a mesocycle. That would be a slightly more in-depth plan based off that macro cycle, the long-term plan. That kind of, in this one, you would plan a bit more specifically what you're working on. You would cover the volumes, the intensities, and the densities you're going to use. In simple terms, kind of how many reps you want to be doing, what percentages you want to be working out, and how often in the week you would be doing that. Basically, you do this because it allows your week-to-week programming to be super, super easy, rather than having to refer back in your mind and work out exactly where you are. You've got a template to refer back to. You say like, oh, month number 3, this is what I'm working on. This is what I've done previously. Therefore, I know exactly where I should be, and it makes your programming one hell of a lot easier. When it comes to, again, to CrossFit, the focusing on different physical capacities in each block becomes a little more difficult, because CrossFit is one of those things where you kind of need to work on everything at once. But again, it's really useful to do because you can have different volumes of different things at different times. So if you want to bias your strength, you could do like 80% of your monthly training on strength and 20% on your cardio, and that help maintain your conditioning and your cardio whilst you develop your strength, so you don't lose it completely. Then from this kind of mesocycle, this training block, you can move into what's called your microcycle. So that's your kind of week to week, what we refer to as programming. This is writing your sessions out. So these usually run off a week, but they can kind of go off anywhere from 4 to 10 day cycles. As I said, this is just writing your day-to-day programs. This is kind of where what we more enjoy doing, writing sessions, having a bit of fun with it, working on things you want to work on. But it's important to have those previous two, the macro and the mesocycles, in place, basically to tell you and advise you what you need to do in these week-to-week programs to make sure you're still actually working towards your goal and they're progressive in nature. Otherwise, if you just do the microcycle and you just write week to week your programming with no guideline, it's super easy to miss the bigger picture and not to kind of take into account where you've been, where you started, where you want to go, and all the steps that are required to get there. It's quite easy just to write stuff you want to do, write the stuff you're enjoying, or just kind of make up random stuff which you think might help. So while this is kind of the fun bit and the bit you do day to day and the bit you see day to day, it's important to have that thought process behind it all. Even if it's not in detail, but you've got that guideline and that kind of roadmap about where to go. I spoke earlier about why you wouldn't want to do a detailed plan up front because you're probably not going to stick to it. And if you're one of those people that's very rigid with their rules, then often you can stick to it too much to the detriment of your own physical development, because you can find things that are working well or things that aren't working well. And due to not wanting to change your program because you spent all that time right now, you end up not changing when you should. So when this comes to someone like you guys, who you're not writing programs for professional athletes, you're just trying to develop something that you personally want to improve on. For example, if someone wants to develop their gymnastics capacity, they find that they really enjoy CrossFit, but whenever they get to a WOD which has gymnastic stuff in, kipping pull-ups, for example, they really struggle. And in CrossFit classes, there's not enough for them personally to improve. So they want to spend a little bit of time in open gym developing that. You still need to have that structure. You still need to develop a plan going forwards, because you need to fit that training into your bigger picture life. Your current training you're doing in CrossFit class, around your work schedule, around your sleep schedule, etc. There needs to be that plan so you can fit it in there and you can step back and look at it and be like, and basically ask yourself if that makes sense. Something that's important to remember is everyone has a certain amount of what's often referred to as adaptation currency. Kind of how much adaptation can your body do in a given time? You can't constantly get better at everything. There's a limit on that. So when you put something into a training program, you almost always got to take something back out to balance that out again. So if you just kind of add your training program in on top of what you do elsewhere, unless your recovery is on point, you might end up not going anywhere and actually negatively affecting your overall performance. As I said earlier, it's really important to build the foundations of whatever your goal is. So if you do know these, then great, that gives you a bit of a head start. If not, then approach a coach about it, because that's kind of our job. If you come to us and say, I want to improve my butterfly pull-ups, what do I need to work on in particular? We can tell you kind of where you're at now. We can help you understand that and what steps you need to take to move there. And then using this kind of structure, you can design your own training program from there, which suits you. And making sure, we can help you make sure that it fits in with your other programming. We can give you examples of what you might need to take out. For example, if you're someone who does like a Mob Strong class and then a Mob Engine, if you're looking to add in some extra gymnastics work, might make sense to not do the Mob Engine that day and add your gymnastics in instead. So there's a give and a take there rather than just adding it on top. I've got there the interference effect is exacerbated by poor programming. So interference effect basically refers to how too much training volume or a training capacity which kind of directly opposes another one can basically affect your ability to get better at something. For example, doing a load of endurance training can interfere with how strong you can get. For example, a marathon runner training for a marathon is not going to be able to get really, really strong at the same time because the amount of volume they're doing of endurance work gets in the way of their ability to get strong. And someone who's looking to be the world's strongest man is not going to go train for a marathon. But there is certainly a balance in the middle, which you can improve both at the same time, but you just need to be very well balanced with your programming, your recovery, nutrition, etc. So I'm going to go into quite a simple planning strategy, which you guys can use. we're going to go into a case study, but you can apply this to whatever given thing you want to work on personally. So as we said earlier, you would assess your current performance in whatever capacity you feel like you want to improve. You'd have your long-term goal. And then from your long-term goal, you'd work backwards towards what your current performance is and lay out the steps you need to take to get from your current level to your goal. So we're going to go through a little bit of a case study of that. So I've basically just gone into what's something that quite a common avatar we see in the CrossFit gyms is people, not particularly females exactly, but I'm just going to use that as an example today, who's kind of been CrossFitting for 1 to 2 years, who struggle with developing kipping pull-ups. So their current performance level, 2 to 3 strict pull-ups with 5 kipping pull-ups, they can link those together. Their current training regime would be 4 to 5 times a week of just CrossFit classes, and they don't do any training outside. And they struggle with all kind of pulling, so rows, single arm rows, any kind of barbell movements, ring rows, anything like that. They struggle a little bit with when it comes to CrossFit. And also they have a little bit of shoulder instability, so they end up getting, if they do too much volume, they end up getting a little bit of shoulder issues. So this is just like a common avatar we often see. So if I was this person looking to develop my goal of bigger set of kipping pull-ups, how would I go about designing that? So what I'd do is I'd start, hold on, get the pointer out. I'd start here. This is where their current level is. It's 2 to 3 strict pull-ups and 5 kipping. This down this end is their goal, 20 unbroken kipping pull-ups. There's obviously a bit of difference between those two. The steps we need to take, we can lay those out now. Imagine from this end to this end is your macro cycle. That's your big long-term plan. Each one of these steps is your mesocycle. That's your little short-term block. And then week to week, inside each one of these steps is your week-to-week planning, your microcycle, your 1 week, your sessions, etc. So if we want to get from the 2 to 3 strict pull-ups and 5 kipping to your 20 unbroken kipping, what do you need to work on first? Well, we already know from the avatar that this individual struggles with shoulder strength and stability. So that's one of the capacities that massively underpins your upper body strength. So that's what we'd need to work on first. So you'd start with your shoulder stability and your strength. You build your strict strength because that underpins your kipping to a desirable level before moving on to your kipping stuff. This one, you can use a lot of variation here and all types of upper body pulling. You then move on to step number 2. You'd continue developing strict strength and you start implementing some kipping drills to start kind of working on the technique involved in that. Once you move on from there, you move on to, you'd isolate your kipping skill. So this means there'd be no fatigue involved. You'd be very low reps. You're working on the technique and you're developing that technique and that skill. At the same time, you're still developing a bit of strength and you're maintaining that. Then your final step towards moving on to your 20 unbroken is you'd take that a step further and you'd build volume on that kipping movement. You would practice it under a little bit of fatigue, you'd up the volume, you could use EMOMs here. Each one of these steps builds upon the last one. So these kipping drills rely on the fact that you've got shoulder strength and stability from here. Then the isolated kipping skill here relies on the fact that you've developed a nice kipping movement from your drills here. And then your volume build here relies on the fact that you've developed a really nice skill here. If you were to jump straight to building the kipping volume, which is what most people would do, they go, oh, I just want to improve my kipping pull-ups, therefore I'm just going to practice kipping pull-ups, then you miss all of these steps which are required to be able to do this movement well. So that's why taking that step back and looking at that bigger picture and what you need to do individually to get you from A to B is more important than just going, this is what I want to do, therefore I'm going to practice this thing until I can do it. So we're going to zoom in kind of very quickly on each step. So we're going to use step 1 as an example. If you're looking to develop that shoulder strength and stability, what we want to do is you want to lay out a volume, intensity and density sessions in that week. Say this is a 4-week block. You'd do, for example, a nice starting point might be 2 sessions a week, which you add in on top of your CrossFit programming. You want to start your volume quite low. So you might start 8 sets, and you're going to add 2 sets each week for your 4 weeks. So you start 8 sets in the first week, 10 sets in the second week, 12, 14. So you've got that volume progression, because that's going to help basically drive that adaptation and consistently add a bigger stimulus. You're going to start your intensity quite low, kind of 60%, 6 out of 10, nice and easy. If you don't start easy, then it's just going to get harder each week anyway. So you really need to make sure you start quite easy. And you're going to progress that weekly. That progress is kind of be a little bit more individual. Often it's difficult to say you're going to add 5% or 10% each week. Body tends not to work that well that way. So you can just go off how it feels. That's why we quite like the RPE at the gym at the moment. The kind of 7 out of 10 to 10 out of 10 effort level. That can change day to day. A 7 on one day is very different to a 7 on another day. Your exercise selection, kind of what exercise you pick, because we're really early on. We're in the first step from your current level towards the end goal. You're going to start very general. So general means basically any exercise which assists the exercise you're trying to develop. The specific exercise would be a pull-up, because that's what you're trying to improve. But a general exercise would be anything which genuinely improves pulling movements. Think bent over rows, single arm rows, banded pull-aparts, etc. So they're all things that are going to start general. They're going to improve all the capacities that you need to improve your specific exercise. As you build throughout the kind of whole long cycle, you're going to increase your specific exercises and decrease your general. Basically, that'll help you get more work done on the thing you're trying to improve, but make sure you have developed the underpinning capacities in the first place. For example, if you were to do a deadlift, you might want to spend some time increasing your hamstring and your core strength at the start, rather than just jumping in and trying to deadlift all the time. After a while, your body's going to get very used to that, and it's not going to have developed the underpinning things you need to get better at deadlifts. So taking the time at the start to build those, and then easing the deadlift volume and intensity up later on in the program when you've already built that base is really important. The deloads, you can start thinking about these here. These are important, but what I would say is I wouldn't structure these up front. I would structure these if and when you feel you need them. Some people do a really good job of being able to train for around like 8 to 12 weeks without taking any kind of rest week. Other people, myself for example, I have to deload fairly often. I don't have a particularly high tolerance for training volume or intensity. So whenever I feel like I need to dial back a little bit, I would do that. This is very, very individual, so it's difficult for me to give you an exact number here, but that's something you would learn over time. Once you've laid out those, you know kind of how many sort of reps you're going to be doing in a range, what kind of intensity you're going to be working at, how often you're going to do it, and what kind of exercises you're going to use. With that information, it's super, super easy to write your weekly training program, which is really specific to your individual goal, right? If you didn't know any of these, you didn't know what volume you're going to use, you didn't know what intensity you're meant to be using, you didn't know how often you're going to do it, and you didn't really know what exercise you're going to do, you're just kind of hoping for the best and throwing stuff together. So that's why having that plan to refer back to is really, really easy. It makes weekly session design really, really easy. So when we're writing your CrossFit programs, or for me, I'm writing the MobLift programs, I have a plan written out in advance. So week to week, I can just refer back to that, input some exercises with the correct volume and intensities, which work towards the goals I'm trying to get you guys to achieve. So it makes my week to week planning really easily, meaning I can do a week's programming in 20 minutes quite comfortably because I've done the planning at the start. If I didn't do that planning at the start, it would take me hours to get a week program done because I don't have anything to refer off. So it might take a little bit more time up front, but it's really worth it in the long term. So I'm going to go into an example of your weekly session design. This is based off that avatar we worked on. First week of your block, of your very first block. So your very beginning. What do you do to really start this? So we spoke about the density in the last one, 2 times a week. So we got 2 sessions. What we were looking to do is we improve shoulder strength and stability. And your reps, you were trying to keep the volume relatively high, The intensity was relatively low, so it's not super, super hard work. So what we've got in the first week, shoulder stability circuit, scapular pull-ups, banded pull-aparts, shoulder taps, just shoulder stability exercises, 3 rounds of those, 60 seconds rest in between. Eccentric pull-ups. This is your one specific exercise of the week. It's a pull-up. It's developing that. These ones are pretty hard work. This is your only high intensity one of the week. You've got your 3 sets of 3 reps with a tempo on there. You can control those reps. Their reps are low. Over the weeks, you'd increase those. Gives you something to increase upon. If you've got this written down, you can do next week, you could do 3 sets of 5 reps. The week after, you could do 4 sets or 3 reps, etc. And you're gradually progressing those. Your second section, again, it's your shoulder stability circuit, slightly different exercises. And then you've got more general exercises. So we've got your one specific exercise over here, and then here, here, and here is all general. So we've got 2/3 of your work being general, 3/4 of your work being general, and 1/4 of your work being specific. As you move closer towards your end goal, your pull-ups, you'd probably have 3/4 of your work being specific, being exact pull-up work, and 1/4 being your general stuff. So this stuff was super easy to write out because of all the work I'd done prior. Does that make sense? Cool. Right, so we're quickly going to cover auto-regulation and kind of flexibility in your training. Your auto-regulation for your training basically means how you personally can regulate your own training. When we've written out programs for you to follow and it says do 5 times 5 at this percentage, on a good day, that would be fine. On some days, that's a lot harder. And to your body doesn't know what weights it's using. It just knows how hard it's working. So if 70% on one day is really, really easy, and the next time you do 70%, it's really, really tough, then that's going to be a different stimulus to the body. So being able to regulate yourself a little bit and make sure you're going after what your specific plan was. I mean, the phrase "listen to your body" is thrown around a lot, but it actually has quite a lot of validity to it. The only issue I often find is people can sometimes listen to that a little too much and use it as a bit of an excuse not to train hard. That's why I think it's quite important to have both subjective and objective measures. So what we can use is your subjective measures. It's kind of how you feel. How did you sleep the night before? How sore are you? Have you got pain anywhere? How tired are you? They're good things to use. They're just feelings, right? That's kind of intuition. Then you've got your objective measures, which would be your performance measures and your recovery measures. So, for example, if someone uses the Whoop, that tells them what their recovery looks like. Again, they're useful guides, but they're not exactly accurate. So using them as a guideline alongside your subjective measures are quite useful. Your objective measure of performance metrics can be useful as in, does my weight I'm using today feel the way it should feel? If I'm doing 5 sets of 5 at 60%, it shouldn't be super, super tough. If you're absolutely dying and you're losing technique, then that would be a really clear sign that it would be time to change that, whether you change it in the session or you dial back the entire week. That kind of depends. So that's where I've got down here where it says rest day, reduction in volume intensity, or you change the stimulus. It kind of depends on how you feel. If it's a consistent thing, it's kind of been 3 days where you feel shit and all your training's not going well, that's a clear sign that probably a rest day is in order. If it's just that one day, you're not reeling very fast, you're not reeling very powerful, your reps aren't feeling great, then a little reduction in volume and intensity would be good. So say instead of 5 sets of 5, you might just do 3 sets of 5. You'll maintain the same speed and the same kind of intent behind each one of those sets, rather than doing the 5 where it might have dropped off a little bit. The important thing to remember is everyone is really different when it comes to dealing with volume and intensity. You have to be honest with yourself with that one. It's quite easy just to see other people do stuff and go, I can do that too. I mean, I've fallen into this trap many times where you see top level athletes training 3 times a day and they're recovering from it and they're fine. They don't take a day off. That's an individual thing. I learned the hard way where I tried doing that for a while and end up basically breaking down so much that I had to take 6 months off CrossFit and training full stop. So I got a really bad back injury from that. So I learned the hard way. You just have to be honest with yourself. Of some people, especially those with stressful jobs, bad sleep routines, who don't look after their nutrition particularly well, then your tolerance for training volume and intensity is going to be lower. And it's not a case of just work around it and push through. If your training volume is high and you can't recover from that, you're not going to get better. It's just going to be a case of you stagnate and you keep doing all the hard work, but you're not going to get better from it. And that's just going to be really demoralizing and a complete waste of time. So being honest with that, and if you've been training for 3 years, doing the same thing, banging your head against the wall, you're not getting any better, adding training is probably not the right way to go. Improving your recovery and adding more rest recovery days in is probably the right way to go on that one. So that's what we were just talking about. The rest days, this depends on the individual. You can use a few guidelines to this. Are you getting better over time? If you don't feel like you're getting better ever and you're just kind of staying the same, then it might be time to increase your recovery. That's when you get better, right? You don't get better when you're training. You break yourself down and you cause a stimulus on your body, but you adapt to that and you recover when you're resting. So if you're not resting enough, then you can't get better, regardless of how much training you do. This one here, your cortisol addiction, is actually a really important one. Often you can feel really shit and then you do a training session and you feel great. While that can be useful sometimes, basically what causes that is when you train, your body releases cortisol to basically get blood sugar, carbohydrates into your bloodstream to fuel that energy. That gives you a momentary perk up, makes you feel better. But that really can mask kind of a bigger problem. If you have to train to feel good, then your underlying lifestyle needs a lot of work. And being honest with yourself about that and not just continuing to train and continuing to be one of those people that needs that little cortisol bump. Good example of this is people who need to work really high intensity all the time. If you're someone who doesn't feel like, if you're super out of breath, flat on your ass at the end of each session, that it wasn't a good workout, you may be one of these people. So it might be a good thing to check out and see if you can be happy to sit on the sofa for a couple of days, maybe go for a walk and still feel good physically. If not, there might be something you need to work on a little bit more around your lifestyle practices. Cool. So once you've completed a training block and you've either got to your goal or you didn't quite make it, but you've still improved, then as we spoke about earlier with that diagram, it's just a constant cycle. So basically you rinse and you repeat. I mean, if it worked really well, you nailed your goal and you want to improve on that, then if the program's not broke, you don't try and fix it. So you can continue using that one until that doesn't work anymore. I mean, there's the law of diminishing returns. The more often you do something, the less effective that thing becomes. So you wouldn't just use the same program over and over again. You want to tweak things. But that's why you have all that data from your long-term plan, your short-term plan, and then your weekly plan, because you can see what worked and what didn't. If you don't have that written down, you have no idea what worked, and you're just kind of guessing at what was successful or what didn't work. You can also, a good thing to do whilst you're training is make mental notes or even physical notes of kind of how you felt at different times. You can get an idea of what was too much volume for you, or if you felt great the entire time, you probably didn't do enough, because there will be times where in training where you do feel a bit beaten up. But you need to have that data to refer back to. The biggest thing being that success leaves clues, right? If you were super successful in a training program, you need to be able to work out from that training program what part of that made that successful. I mean, that only comes with time and practice about constantly refining what you're doing and actually having a thought process behind it, rather than just churning up to the gym and doing whatever you fancy day to day and kind of hoping some of it gets you better. And then when some of it does get you better, you don't really know what got you better. So that's why it's important to have that long-term plan to refer back to each time. So we're going to go into your specific training qualities very quickly. This won't last too long because then we're going to do a little bit of question and answer stuff. If you're trying to improve strength and power, then realistically you need to be working in a high percentage, a high intensity. It needs to be between 70 to 100% of your 1 rep max, or 7 out of 10 RPE. The difficulty with this one is some people will need to be always working at 95% plus. Some people can get strong at 70% quite easily. That's quite an individual thing. Usually the longer you've been training for, the higher intensity you have to work at to get strong. If you've been strength training for 5+ years, working at 70% is basically going to do fuck all for you anymore, which gets a little frustrating when you see other people who are improving from barely doing anything. Strength is quite a difficult one because it's a very broad term. It encompasses your max strength and your strength endurance. So the reps we've set out for those can be anywhere between the 5 to 20 sets of 1 to 15 reps. So your 20 sets, that would be something if you're really, really well trained and you've been training for years. Anything less than 5 sets, you're probably not giving enough of a stimulus in the week. And 1 to 15 reps, 15 would traditionally be strength endurance, 1 would be traditionally max strength. Think about that on a big continuum. So anywhere along those, depending on what you want to work on. Max strength, lower reps, strength endurance, slightly higher reps is a nice simple way to look at that. Important thing to remember is your strength adaptation is always context specific, right? If I work on my squat strength and train that, my bench press isn't going to go up, right? So you have to train individual specific movements or body parts that you want to try and improve. If you're looking for power, power being moving a relatively lightweight or a moderate weight really fast, think like a power snatch or a dumbbell snatch, etc. That would be power endurance if you're doing lots of reps. That's kind of 30 to 60% of your 1 rep max. Is something a bit lighter, which you can move really, really fast. Those ones, you need a little bit less volume because that's super demanding on your nervous system. The important thing to remember is you actually need a really big base of strength first before you can express power properly. So that would be, if you're looking to improve your power, again, one of your previous blocks or 2 of your previous blocks before working on your power, you'd want to develop your strength because that's the underpinning capacity which allows you to express power. If we were to talk about muscle gain, kind of hypertrophy or gaining muscle mass, this one has a lot more research out there on it. A minimum of 10 sets per body part per week is kind of suggested for your gaining muscle mass. The reps, that's anywhere between 3 to 30 reps can cause hypertrophy. Obviously, the important thing to remember there is you do low reps, it has to be heavy. And if you do high reps, it has to be light because you're working one of 2 things. Either tension, how much tension is going through the muscle can cause muscle growth, or metabolic stress. Think about the burn. When you're doing 150 wall balls and your legs are screaming at you, that's causing metabolic stress, which can bring about muscle growth. The important thing to remember is, unfortunately, whatever one you use, they have to be hard work. The tension has to be there. It has to be really hard, really heavy, tough. Your technique has to be on point. And when it comes to metabolic stress, you've got to really drive that pretty high. So that's like working through those really high sets of front squats or dumbbell squats, etc., where the legs are on absolute fire, but making sure you keep pushing through those because you're building that metabolic stress. Important thing to remember is it has to be progressive in nature. You have to continually make training harder to consistently get better at it. That's probably the most frustrating thing about training is the better you get at it, the more painful it becomes because you have to do either more of it or train harder. But that's just part of it. That's one of the reasons that I find training such a fascinating thing is you can't cheat it. You've just got to put the work in. You've got to get it done. When it comes to muscle growth as well, you've just got to be patient. Muscle growth is really, really slow. If you do it naturally, I mean, a lot of people you see on social media do not do it naturally. So they gain 10 kilo of muscle mass in 6 weeks or 8 weeks. Realistically, that's not going to happen unless you're happy to inject yourself with something. You just have to deal with the fact it's really slow and be consistent with it. Gaining 5 kilo of pure muscle mass is like a 2-year process if you're going to do it properly and you don't want to gain a hell of a lot of body fat with it. So being patient, being consistent with it. Finally, endurance. So endurance, you have a continuum from your aerobic, being your long, slow, steady state in the presence of oxygen, or your pure anaerobic, which is realistically, in the grand scheme of things, it's weightlifting work. It's really short, sub 5 second intervals. Most of CrossFit work is somewhere on that continuum. Realistically, CrossFit is mainly aerobic, other than the weightlifting part, which is mainly anaerobic. Your aerobic fitness is the most important quality to work on. If you've got a big base of that, your strength work and your power work comes much easier. It's your recovery system. So if you don't have that developed, you're not going to get better. The important thing to remember is when you look at high-level CrossFitters, they do what for us is anaerobic work. They make it aerobic. So something like Fran, for example, where the rest of us, normal human beings, finish Fran and we lay on the floor for 10 minutes feeling like absolute shit. That's why Rich Froning can finish Fran much faster than any of us and then walk across the finish line and be normal, is because he's made that workout aerobic. He is at such a high level of performance that a anaerobic for the rest of us is aerobic for him. Yeah. When it comes to endurance, you can progress it via kind of how often in the week you do it, the time duration you do it for, and the speed. It has to be progressive in nature. So you want to start, for example, if you were to do a run 15 minutes, the next week you might do 20 minutes, 25 minutes, etc. You're just going to progress it. And the same as strength, endurance is quite context specific. If you're a very good rower, doesn't mean you're going to be a very good rower doesn't mean you're going to be a really good runner. So whatever you want to develop, you have to work on that specific capacity too. I mean, there will be carryover to some degree, but if you want to get better at a specific thing, you have to work on it. All right, guys, I'm going to come out of this now and give you lot a chance to answer some questions. So if anyone's got any questions regarding kind of how to design their own program or what would work for them, give me a shout. Now's the chance.
Just one question about one of the sentences, Stu. When you said 5 to 10 sets of 1 to 5 reps per week, I may be being stupid, but do you mean 1 to 2 sessions per week?
Did it say sessions or?
No, you said 1 to 5 sets of 1 to 5 reps per a week. What does that?
So throughout your sessions in the week, you would split those reps up however you want. So if you were to do 2 sessions in the week, you would want to split.
Oh, okay. So 10 sets of 5 reps, and you'd want to split them up maybe over 3 sessions.
Yes. Yeah. So say you might do if you did 2 sessions, you might do 5 sets of chest on one day and 5 sets of chest on the other day.
Okay, that makes sense.
The frequency is less important as long as you get the total volume done.
Like your total in a week. Yeah. Okay.
Anyone else, guys?
Hi, Stu. I've got a Kevin here. I've got a question about blending your own programming with the
You're breaking up, dude.
typical box.
Kevin, you're breaking up. I cannot hear you.
We can't hear you, man. Your internet's very bad.
Hello, can you hear me? Now, better?
Try now.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can now.
Oh, sorry. Yep. So if I'm trying to focus on working on, say, pull-ups for a particular mesocycle, and I've written out some kind of program, like what you showed, how do I blend that with the typical box programming, or how do I think about my class selection?
Yeah, so
when I go about my week.
Yeah, good question. That's why the auto regulation becomes really, really important, right? If you have pull-up programming and then pull-ups get programmed in CrossFit class and you've signed into that class, couple of options there. Either you can ask the coach if you can do your specific program in that class for the pull-up section, if it's in the strength section, or you can miss your program and do the CrossFit class, which has pull-ups in, because that still counts towards your overall volume. If you were to skip out that CrossFit class and then just say do Mob Strong instead and work on something else you want to work on, that's fine. Basically, it's a little bit of that give and take. I mean, if you've written a pull-up program and then the whole week of CrossFit is pull-ups, then I would suggest maybe doing Mob Engine and then doing your own pull-up program. So I know it's difficult for you guys because the programming is only released the night before, but doing your best to work around that. And if the coach, have a conversation with that coach in that class and say, I'm following this program and trying to develop these. Can I switch these pull-ups out for something else, or can I do something slightly different? And realistically, they should do their best to help you out with that. That makes sense?
Yep, that helps. Thanks.
Cool. I think there is a class at 12, right? So we should probably let those of you who are currently sitting here very confused about what class is happening. I'll let you guys get off for your class. Any other questions, guys? Just send me a message.
Yeah, that was really good.
You can
that's really good, Sue. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you so much for
private message me on Instagram, send me WhatsApp. Yeah.
It's
Great.
thanks, Stuart.
Really good.
Yeah, bye bye, Stuart.